This is the Meetinghouse with Dwight A. Moody. News, reviews, commentary, and conversation on religion and American life. Now, here is Dr. Moody.
And hello, everybody, and welcome to the Meetinghouse. I am Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from our studio today in Greenville, South Carolina, where it's a wintry day. We've had a lot of snow over the last week, a lot of snow still on the ground, and it's very cold and overcast. And they say another storm's coming in, but I hope you're safe, warm where you are, and with people you like. We're coming to you today with our program on religion and American life. We're broadcasting, as always, over the radio out of Brunswick, Georgia, and over the social media out of Louisville, Kentucky. We're broadcasting, of course, on the meetinghouse.net Facebook page, as well as my personal Facebook page, Dwight A. Moody. My guest today, I'll introduce him in just a few minutes, back in the Meetinghouse. I think it was more than a year ago when he first made his first visit to the Meetinghouse. Dr. Robert P. Jones, the founder and CEO of Public Religion Research Institute of Washington, D.C. He is the author of the widely acclaimed books, The End of White Christian America and White Too Long. I have read and reviewed both of these books. You can find my reviews at themeetinghouse.net. But as always, we start with the news today. I've got 5 news stories brought to you by Perfecto Coffee Inc. out of California. We're starting today in Indianapolis, Indiana with the Lilly Endowment. They've made a $20 million grant to the African American Cultural Heritage Action Fund to assist with their campaign to provide resources for Black churches in the United States. The Heritage Action Fund is an initiative of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. The money will be used to address both the needs of congregations and the needs of their buildings. Grants will be given to more than 50 congregations over the next 3 years and may be used to fund ongoing programs, special projects, or emergency needs, such as the destruction of churches in Mayfield, Kentucky, due to the recent tornado. The Action Fund has raised more than $70 million since it was launched in 2017. Let's go to Dallas, Texas, or at least on the outskirts. Congregation Beit Israel on the outskirts of the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex was the site of the latest attack on a house of worship. The perpetrator, Malik Faziel Akram, a 44-year-old British citizen. The occasion was Saturday morning Shabbat services, live streamed to those unable to attend in person. Akram was invited into the service as a guest, welcomed by Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker. Later, Akram pulled out a gun and threatened the small group. After a long period of detainment, Rabbi Citron Walker distracted Akram by throwing a chair. Akram was subsequently shot and killed. The family of Akram said publicly that he had a history of mental illness. During the hostage event, Akram spoke of the incarceration of a Pakistani in a prison near Fort Worth on suspicion of terrorist activities. Out to the West Coast, Seattle. The U.S. Supreme Court, consistent with recent decisions, has agreed to hear an appeal by a man dismissed as football coach in a public high school because he knelt on the field after games and prayed, often with student athletes. After several years and a handful of complaints, the school system ordered Coach Joseph A. Kennedy to stop. And he did for 1 game. But he returned to the practice and was dismissed by the district, after which he filed a federal discrimination lawsuit. He was denied his freedom of religion, he contends. The federal district and appeals courts denied his claim, but the newly conservative and thoroughly religious Supreme Court has taken the case. A decision is expected in the spring. To Springfield, Missouri. Influential Pentecostal minister George O. Wood has died at the age of 90. Wood grew up in China, but spent his ministerial career in the United States, rising through the ranks to become general superintendent of the Assemblies of God. Along the way, he earned both a PhD and a law degree, served as pastor, professor, and denominational administrator. He led the Assemblies of God to diversify its leadership ranks to include both women and people of various ethnic traditions. Wood reached out to the Black Pentecostal denominations and joined in Black Lives Matter rallies, but he also warned of a day when Christians would be persecuted because they resisted the wickedness of American culture. To Lexington, Kentucky. Now, this story is about religion in America only to those who live in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, of which I'm a native. Joe B. Hall has died at the age of 93. Hall was the head basketball coach for the University of Kentucky for 13 years, following the forced retirement of Adolph Rupp. During his tenure, Hall won the NCAA championship in 1978 against Duke University, which of course made him a saint in his home state. After his retirement from coaching in 1983, Hall returned to his hometown of Cynthiana, just northeast of Lexington, where he continued to enjoy popularity among the fans. Hall was an active member of the Christian church in his hometown. And everywhere, this past weekend, churches and communities throughout the country and some parts of the world celebrated the national holiday named for the famed Baptist preacher Martin Luther King Jr. Marches, worship services, political rallies, and other community events were held to commemorate King's ministry to the church and his leadership of the civil rights movement. King was assassinated in 1968. As a result, many cities named roads, streets, parks, and memorials for the slain leader. The holiday was established at local and state levels as early as 1971 and made a national holiday by federal legislation signed by President Ronald Reagan in 1986. That's the news brought to you by Perfecto Coffee. You can order your coffee from perfectocoffeeinc.com. Stay tuned for my conversation with Robert P. Jones on Christian nationalism, the insurrection, and prophetic religion. You are in the Meetinghouse, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm Dwight A. Moody, your host, and today I welcome back to the Meetinghouse Dr. Robert P. Jones, the founder and CEO of Public Religion Research Institute of Washington, D.C. Robert, welcome back to the Meetinghouse.
Thanks. I'm glad to be back.
I look forward to a great conversation. The last time we were on air together, we talked about your book, The End of White Christian America, and the book White Too Long. I told you then what a powerful book it was for me because you described not only your own journey, but the journey that I've had as well, and many, many other people. We've got a lot to talk about today. The insurrection of last year, the rise of Christian nationalism, talk of a civil war, talk of prophetic religion, and of course, Martin Luther King Jr. You wrote an article just this week about that, and we'll get to that in just a minute. But 1 year ago, you were the first person to write, I think the day after the insurrection, and you wrote about and described the religious dimensions to the insurrection. You drew attention to the symbols and the rhetoric of the mob that stormed the Capitol. That's been 1 year from that stunning event. What do you think now about the Christian roots of the insurrection?
Yeah, well, it is hard to believe we're a year out from that event. I was deeply, shaken, and and I'm, like you, a long time, follower of public events, and I'm jaded enough that it takes a lot to shake me. But when I saw, crosses being raised
Mhm.
next to Confederate flags and the Christian flag, that I grew up with
Right.
sitting on the platform right behind the pulpit, this white flag with a blue canton, a red Latin cross up in the corner, being marched into the breached, chambers of Congress, again, along with the Confederate flag, other symbols of hate, anti-Semitic symbols, and I talked about it being kind of comfortably intermingled with those
Yeah.
symbols of hate, and I think that's the thing that really shook me. The Atlantic's Jeffrey Goldberg was on the ground and recording people do, uh, with cheers that were saying, uh, give it up for Jesus, and people yelling and screaming, and right behind it, give it up for Trump. So this kind of just intermingling. I also called it an unholy amalgamation in that piece of violence, hate, and Christian. Christian symbols. It was just shocking. Like I said, even to me, is a little bit, jaded about these things. So, yeah, so I put pen to paper and just tried to write about how disturbing it is that those symbols can so comfortably coexist. And I actually used that for the paperback edition of White Too Long came out in July of this past year, and I actually based the afterword on that piece, talking about the threat of Christian nationalism today, and that it wasn't just one episodic, a fringe group of people on one day, but this is really a broader movement that we have to take quite seriously.
I think it's very interesting that you um, raise your memory, which is my memory as well, growing up in churches that had the American flag on one side of the pulpit and the Christian flag on the other. And as I got into my own ministry and started um, first in a rural church in Indiana and then a suburban church in Pittsburgh, I, like a lot of people, became very convicted that this was a bad thing. Uh, but your mentioning of it today shows you how millions of people all across the country were emotionally and visually prepared for these two flags to fly in the same event, such as we saw a year ago. Um, and of course, we were both shocked. Millions of people were shocked, but we've been seeing these flags march together for a long time. We grew up with it.
Yeah, I think that I think you're right. First of all, to say, I mean, I recall, Stanley Hauerwas, a
Yes.
theologian, longtime professor at Duke, saying like one of the most important things pastors could do is take the American flag
Mhm.
out from
Right.
behind the pulpit,
Right.
to kind of drive a wedge between a Christian, I know we're going to talk about this word later, prophetic kind of Christian voice that's able to speak truth to power, and one that's kind of wrapped around American identity, is something quite different and something dangerous. So I think that foundation's been laid a long time ago. I think here's what's different though. Like I think that has its own set of problems, but what I think is different and even more problematic though is a kind of narrowing of. It's one thing to sort of have a kind of connecting of Christian identity to American identity writ large. But what we're seeing today is something even different than that, and it is this narrowing of even what counts as American identity to be Christian identity, right, and to be a
Right.
particular kind of white Protestant Christianity writ large, with maybe some Catholics thrown in, but this sense that it is not just all Americans and this tie to Christianity, but that only people who are this kind of Christian are authentically American, right? So this thing about make America great again, save America, right, was the theme that day. So if you interrogate save America and you put those symbols together, it is really saying we are the true Americans, right? And if you put the mix together, it's anti-Semitism, white supremacy, Christianity, and we are the true Americans.
Yes, and this in strange juxtaposition to the research that you've done and the book that you wrote on the end of white Christian America. We're seeing the resurgence of what is now a minority of Americans, a minority of Christians as well, against the background of this long-term decline. It makes you wonder, as I think you point out in your book, that the demise or the decline of this demographic is part of what's fueling their anger and their emotion and their violence and their intensity.
Yeah, I think these two things are inextricably linked.
They are.
And there's actually Mike McCurry, the former press secretary for Bill Clinton, actually cited White Too Long today in the New York Times along these
Yeah.
lines. That I think it is. So just to kind of put the numbers out there, as recently as when Barack Obama was first running for president, like our first African American president, the country was pretty comfortably still majority white and Christian. 2008, the country was 54% white and Christian. If you put
Right.
all white Christians together, that number today is 44. Right. When I wrote the book Into White Christian America, the number had only dropped to 47. And I was kind of marking it as a sea change. And as we crossed that threshold, and it's continued to drop another few percentage points even since that book has come out. But I do think it is the sense of losing control.
Right.
Demographics are shrinking. And so what happens is if you lose the ability to influence the culture through just being the majority, and through winning elections fair and square, your next alternative, if winning is what matters at all costs, is violence.
Do you think this Christian nationalism, what has happened in the last year? And I want to frame this by an episode with Robert Jeffries, pastor of the First Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas, a leading spokesperson for these movements that we're talking about. Right after the insurrection, I think, as you have pointed out, and others have as well, he criticized the insurrection as inappropriate, as wrong-headed, as headed in the wrong direction. But he's backed away from that now. And I get the sense, and others are writing about this, that this Christian nationalism has been emboldened by the insurrection a year out. They're not as embarrassed by it as they were. Some people are even calling these people saints instead of criminals. What does the data tell us about this movement? Is it picking up steam?
Well, it's hard to know as a long-term question because, simply put, we've never had the need to track this sort of thing at this level. So, for example, when the team at PRI sat down last fall to write questions for our annual survey, it was kind of stunning that we had to include questions about political violence, questions about QAnon, conspiracy theories, questions about a presidential election actually being stolen. Right. I mean, these are all live questions now. And what we found, for example, is these stunning numbers that 2/3 of Republicans believe the election was stolen. They genuinely tell us what they believe. That 3 in 10 Republicans say that they, because things have gotten so far off track, that there may be a need to resort to violence in order to set things right. That's 3 in 10 people in a mainstream party, and it's 26% of white evangelicals.
Just stunning. But of course, all of us, me included, perhaps you included, have family members in our extended families that are part of this movement. They may not come out and say it in our presence quite as frankly and as strongly as they think and feel. But there's no doubt about it. I can name a whole series of people in my personal network that are part of the movement we are talking about, that have suspicions about the election, that think the election was stolen and Biden is not legitimate. It is just stunning. I mean, every single aspect of this whole drama being played out in our country just continues to stun me, and catch me off guard. And I know it does you as well.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add here, well, kind of one piece of extra data and then a little context, historical context is, the other piece that we did find is like the two big attitudinal predictors of support for political violence, like we saw on January 6th. The biggest one is the belief that the election is stolen. Among people who believe the election was stolen, 4 in 10 support political violence. And then the other one, though, is a Christian nationalist measure, right? People who believe that God has given the United States a special role in human history. That's the question. Among that group, it's nearly 3 in 10 who say that true American patriots may have to resort to violence. And if you look at on the flip side, for those who, it's twice as many compared to those who do not agree with that statement, right? So in other words, believing this kind of special role that God has given the United States makes you twice as likely to support political violence as those who don't believe that. The other thing I would say, though, that just for context, is that we, in the modern political era, we have been laying the foundations for what I would also call a kind of politics of white Christian resentment. We've been laying the groundwork for that at least since the Civil Rights Acts in the mid 1960s.
Great.
And so this kind of stoking of, I mean, the Republican Party, had particularly, what it became known as the Southern strategy,
Mm-hmm.
which was a very explicit strategy of stoking racial resentment among white Christians in the South, as a way of recruiting them to away from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. It was a largely successful move that between 1965 and 1980, when Reagan was elected, there was this incomplete white flight from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, largely over racial resentment. And that's been a steady drumbeat for half a century, right? That's at least 2 generations of white Christians have been instead a steady diet. So Robert Jeffries maybe is like out on the extreme. He hosted, for example, on July 4th, a couple of years back, a whole "Make America Great Again" service where they sang a choral anthem called "Make America Great Again." I mean, it was just unbelievable. So that's an extreme example, but the underlying kind of basic tenets of this, like I said, have been, kind of in the DNA for quite some time.
Yes, I reported on that Robert Jeffries July 4th worship service. Was one of my news items after it happened, and I do remember it. And of course, I was, for the first time in my life, I got press credentials to go to an event, and I went to the Southern Baptist Convention last summer. Of course, I haven't attended myself since 1990, or I guess it was 90 was my last. But I went last summer as a journalist, and had a wonderful time with the other journalists, but was just stunned at the dynamics at play on the floor of that meeting, illustrating exactly what you're talking about. Although some key elections surprised people, stuff going on in the Southern Baptist Convention, in which both you and I were raised, these dynamics right now are dangerous for the convention, because I think they undermine the unity that a denomination that large demands and needs. But it was so close to the rhetoric of violence, even among themselves. The way they talked about each other being dangerous. and illegitimate and all of that was just a microcosm of evidently what's going on in the nation as a whole. Um,
Can I
you know,
just say one
lastly, go
one
ahead.
thing about that? Because I think this is really important. What it seems to me has happened, or one way of putting a lens on it is that, as much as Southern Baptists and conservative white Christians love to talk about themselves as so-called values voters, right? And the
Right.
family, the party of family, and all that stuff. It does seem to me that they have wholesale exchanged a politics of principle for a very crass utilitarian style of politics where the ends justify the means, right? And so if you elevate the ends to be so important, right, that no matter what, our goal is to keep one political figure in office or to make one political party successful, then you stop interrogating the means, and any means become not only kind of wink, wink, nod, nod acceptable, but explicitly articulable. Like Robert Jeffries, I remember hearing a debate between him and Russell Moore in
Hmm.
2016, ahead of before
Right.
former President Trump was elected, and he basically said, it was an NPR aired debate, and he said on air, Jeffries did, he said, look, when I think about the trouble the country is in and where it's headed and how bad that is, I want the meanest son of a what in the Oval Office. And to
Yeah.
me, that's Donald Trump. And that was from, again, someone who's not a fringe religious figure. I mean, he's the senior pastor at the tallest steeple Baptist church in the state of Texas, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
of what's still the largest Protestant denomination in the country, the Southern Baptist Convention.
Yes, I couldn't agree with you more on this. And then if you bring into all of this equation the issue of prophecy. Now,
Yeah.
Robert Jeffries himself is not in what we would generally call the prophetic religion tradition, but I want us to talk about this. My guest last week, Paul Jupe, a person like yourself who's a researcher and a scholar and a writer, he introduced me to this. Now, I've been following charisma.com for several years because I think it's the epicenter of a lot of this rhetoric, a lot of this rationale, a lot of this kind of reasoning that if we don't save America now, it's going to be too late. How can the world be saved if we can't save America? And God has anointed us to do all of this. And of course, they add this whole layer of prophecy. They have uh, these network of prophets. Uh, Talk to us about these prophets and who they are and where they are and how they have so much influence.
Yeah, this is a really very, I think, understudied, overlooked aspect of kind of this movement that's kind of white Christian nationalist movement that we're talking about. So Paul is a friend, longtime friend, colleague.
Right.
He's a PRI affiliated scholar and board member, really well respected scholar, and and he has done some really groundbreaking work. Just published on Religion and
Just,
Public's
just
website.
today, I think it
Yeah,
came out.
yeah,
I
just
got it
today.
today.
And what he's found there is quite interesting, that even among people who believe generally these kind of white Christian nationalist tenets, that this extra belief in prophecy, and I'll explain what he means by
Okay.
that, right, is what he called, actually, I think cleverly and accurately, an accelerant
Yeah.
of belief in violence, of being willing to commit extreme acts, including violence. There, so he's got some great measures there, but I think it is this idea of these charismatic leaders, right, who basically claim to have a direct word from
Hmm.
God, right,
Hmm.
that they as a prophet then relay to their followers. So that confers on them an extraordinary amount of authority and power, right? If they are claiming to be the mouthpiece of God and delivering new, in real time, new revelations from God to God's people, I mean, that's a pretty powerful thing to. And I think one of the reasons why that group, by the way, that is the group that Trump gathered around himself in the White
Yes.
House. Paul
Yes.
White,
Yes.
a bunch of other folks like that. If you're looking for the connective tissue between who those people were in the room, that is it. It is this
This
kind
is
of
it. I agree.
charismatic, prophetic kind of word. And one of the reasons why that fits so hand in glove is because one is it's often linked to the prosperity gospel, right? This idea that if you're faithful, God will reward you with
Right.
good relationships and wealth. And, happy family life and successful work life, but it also fits with Trump's authoritarian style, right? Because if you're a prophet, you have really the ultimate authority, right? And others' job is to listen to you and to obey. So there's a kind of style here that I think that matters. And then in these times where people feel desperate, when people feel like the world, like the other questions we've asked are, do you feel like you're a stranger in your own country? A sense of kind of social, cultural alienation as the demographics of the country are changing around you. A word like this is quite seductive, I think. It says, look, the normal rules don't apply in these extreme end times. It's often apocalyptic, right? And so what it does is it takes the guardrails down from normal limitations on human behavior. Can I pick up a gun? Can I pick up a brick and harm or kill my fellow citizens under normal times? Well, no. But if we are in extreme times, the answer might be yes, according to some of these folks.
And of course, the American public has been conditioned to think in terms of the end of the age, the end of the world, extreme times. I grew up under Hal Lindsey and Late Great Planet Earth,
Yeah.
and then of course the next generation had the Left Behind books.
Right. No, there's a straight line there. You're right.
Straight line, and it's a
Yep.
straight line to what we're talking about today, with the danger that encompasses the whole world, and how God has to intervene, and all this sort of thing. I read Catherine Stewart, the journalist, whose book, "The Power Seekers" or
Power Worshippers.
the Power Worshippers, in her
Yep.
in her recent article in the New Republic, gives this angle on this prophecy stuff, and I thought it was very telling. If God tells you in advance who is supposed to win every election, like these prophets are doing, and then the other candidate wins, the only acceptable explanation is that the election was stolen, and stolen against the wishes of God. This is exactly what you were talking about, giving a religious and theological rationale to this whole thing. That if God spoke to the prophets and told them Trump was supposed to win in 2020, he didn't, then somebody stole it from God. You can imagine how this fuels people's fury and energy, and lights the flame of violence in this,
Yeah.
out of this, what Jupe calls prophetic religion.
Yeah, I think the deeply troubling thing here, is that this is so dangerous both for Christianity and for democracy.
It
Both.
is, and
You know.
and of course her article is just. I've read one line of it, but her long article and her book maybe the same way. I haven't read the book. Uh, a a stirring call to people to wake up to what is happening. And I guess what we're trying to do is determine how strong this movement is, and what its real danger is, and what its goals are.
Yeah, I think that's right. That it's tempting to. I think particularly what happened was I think the daily theatrics of Donald Trump as president sort of numbed us to the extremes, because it was a daily, onslaught of things
Right.
that you thought an American president would not
Yeah.
say or do.
Right.
And so I think we had sort of, really counting the campaign, almost 5 years of that has kind of dulled our sensibilities to where we actually are. But like when I think about, the insurrection, right? So we in the U.S. we have prided ourselves in the peaceful transition of power, right? That's been one of the, speaking of City on the Hill and all that stuff. I mean, that has been kind of the shining American example of democracy to the world. We can no longer say that, right? We had 44, and that's where the streak ended. Peaceful transitions of power.
Right.
We never had, as close as Richmond was to D.C., and even though like right down the street from me at Fort Stevens, a sniper took a shot at President Lincoln, right on the outskirts of D.C. here. We never had ever the Confederate flag marched through
Right.
the U.S. Capitol until this year.
Until this year. And Catherine Stewart, in her, she lays out the financial resources, the people who are funding this movement, and the way they're laying the groundwork for calling the 2024 election stolen if the right person doesn't win, and no telling what will happen. I think that's what her concern is, and that's what all perhaps more of us need to be concerned about.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I'm deeply worried about that. About we heard President Biden even yesterday himself saying he had deep concerns about the legitimacy of the midterm elections, but particularly I think, all eyes on 2024 are exactly right. The Atlantic had a big cover story, that said January 6th was practice.
Yeah, I certainly feel this. And even though I'm broadcasting from Greenville, South Carolina today, I'm a resident of Georgia, where I vote. And of course, all eyes have been on Georgia.
Right.
Actually, for 2 years, where I live in Brunswick. First, the big container cargo ship ran aground. I don't know whether you remember that or followed that 2-year drama. On top of that, Ahmaud Arbery, murder and the trial and all of that. All of that little 2 local dramas inside of the Georgia effort to change the voting rules to restrict and all of that, which is the background of what went on in Congress today, the failure to advance legislation to protect the voting rights. So I've been following all of this on multiple levels and reporting on it. I will have to say that Paul Jupe last week and in his article today described this prophecy religion in much more, he says it's much more diverse than the white evangelicals. It is racially diverse, it is denominationally diverse, with a strong dose of the Pentecostal, which sometimes are evangelicals and sometimes are not. But it is a fascinating dynamic that is confronting all of us, especially people like you that are researching and writing about it. So here is my question. Is there any version of religion in America that has the leadership, the organization, and the courage to push back against Christian nationalism?
I got to say, I hope so. I think we're going to find out in the next few years, between now and 2024. I'll mention a couple, though, that some of you may know of as well. But, the Baptist Joint Committee has actually organized an entire kind of campaign called Christians Against Christian Nationalism.
Yes.
That is actually kind of, they come out of that kind of Southern Baptist, tradition themselves, and I think have a big footprint in more Southern conservative states, and so that's where the challenges are. So I think that's hopeful. The other thing I'll say, and this is something I say with some humility, and I think even kind of midlife embarrassment, is I came so late. Got a little bit of exposure in graduate school, but really even later in life, to taking seriously shaping my own Christian faith through the lens of particularly African American
Mm-hmm.
theology.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a real way in which white, I mean, I write about this in White Too Long, that white Christians have been so tied up in protecting their privileged place in society that it really has distorted our theology. It's distorted our self-understanding. It's distorted our theology, and one of the ways of kind of getting back is to look at theology. It wasn't written from people who were mostly concerned about holding on to their place at the top of the political and social pyramid.
That's exactly right.
And so I've really been trying to do that as a way of kind of growing and really getting a better hold on it. So I would say that, one place that's preserved a version of Christianity that in many ways white people can go back to is the African American church.
And you wrote an article this week on Martin Luther King, challenging us as white liberals to take his words much more seriously. And you quoted a long passage from King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And I agree with you that it's one of the most important documents in American political and religious history. I want to read a sentence, 2 sentences that you put in your article earlier this week in your reflection upon Martin Luther King Day. This is Martin Luther King writing from Birmingham, from the jail. If today's church does not recapture the sacrificial spirit of the early church, it will lose its authenticity, forfeit the loyalty of millions, and be dismissed as an irrelevant social club with no meaning for the 20th century. Every day, I meet young people whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. Well, this is true prophetic religion. And what he saw, he says, I meet young people every day whose disappointment with the church has turned into outright disgust. That was 50 years ago. That's turned into a tsunami, hasn't it?
Yeah, it has. I kind of expound a little bit later in the piece that is up on my Substack newsletter that that we see this in the data today. That we look at the religious disaffiliation rates or how many young people are unaffiliated with any kind of religion.
Yeah.
It's nearly 4 in 10 of Americans under the age of 30 today.
Yeah.
That claim no religious. It's a quarter of all Americans, and it's nearly 4 in 10 Americans under the age of 30. And most of them grew up with this Christian right as the dominant kind of way that they understood religion, right, in public, and have reacted pretty negatively to that. The other thing I would just draw attention to real quickly is that line. One thing that moved me so much is when he talked about the sacrificial spirit of the early church. And can you look at those protesters screaming obscenities and even euphemisms like "Let's go, Brandon," and thinking that that's okay as a Christian to do that, and say, yeah, does this reflect a sacrificial spirit? Like the idea that that what Christianity is about laying down your lives for others rather than defending your own place. I think we just lost our way in a serious way. I mean, I don't say that flippantly, but I think it's pure insanity, really. And it's the world upside down, the gospel on its head. And we've got to be able to see that. It's remarkable to me how many. It tells you where we are and how far we've drifted. That there hasn't been this huge outcry, right? This is what King saw in his day too, right? He was mostly disappointed in the what so-called religious moderates.
Yeah, that's what called, as you explain in your article, that's what called forth his letter from a burning Birmingham jail, his frustration with the white progressive Christians in the country and their failure to deal with reality. And that's very similar to where we are here. Um, in just a minute, I'm going to come back with my commentary for the week, which I entitled King and Graham. And I addressed this issue head on about the legacy of King and the legacy of Graham, and whether either one of those traditions, in their truest and best sense, can provide an alternative, either separately or together, to this what I think is the most important and powerful religious movement in the world today, Christian nationalism, and what it portends and how it threatens us. Dr. Jones, it's great to talk with you about these things. You're such a learned man and you have all these facts at your fingertips and you're doing great work. I guess you've got a book in the works. Tell me you do.
I do actually. So two things in the works. One is kind of a new project on Substack. So I'm writing every week at robertpjones.substack.com. Every Friday, I'm trying to come up with kind of where I am on my own journey, what I'm seeing, what I'm kind of thinking about, and then have a new book that should be out. I'm going to finish up at the end of this year, be out sometime next year. Looking at 4 communities, including their kind of religious communities that have a history of racial violence and how they're working to heal and working for justice and healing in the present against that history.
Well, that sounds like another day in the meeting house to me. We need to talk about that. Thank you for joining us today. It's always good to see you and talk to you. I hope our paths cross again real soon. I'll be one of the first to buy that new book. You're in the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. My guest has been Dr. Robert P. Jones, and we've had a wonderful conversation. This conversation will be posted as a podcast within 24 hours, and you can either watch it on Facebook or listen to it as a podcast when you are available. Stay tuned. I'll be back with my commentary entitled King and Graham. King and Graham, my commentary today, and by that I mean Martin Luther King Jr. and Billy Graham. Here is my question. Can the religious tradition of either of these influential ministers rescue the Christian community in America from the quicksand into which we have fallen? Billy Graham was the first to be born, 1918, and the last to die, 2018, just before he turned 100. He was the most visible and influential itinerant evangelist of his time. For 50 years, he was the face of white evangelical Christianity. Martin Luther King Jr. was younger and lived only 39 years, dying in 1968 at the hands of an assassin in Memphis, Tennessee. He led the most powerful and permanent social movement of our time, the Civil Rights Movement. But is the legacy of either of them strong enough to counter the double-barreled attack that has left the church, the Christian church, reeling from its long-established role as a center of cultural and moral power? Graham and his version of the gospel shaped the majority of Americans, including me. He preached and we practiced a religion focused on getting saved from our sins so that we could secure a place in heaven when we die. Of his 34 published books, 2 of them, Till Armageddon and Approaching Hoofbeats, fueled the popular fascination with the end of the world. There's a major boulevard on the outskirts of Charlotte, North Carolina, named for Graham. It takes the traveler to the Graham Library, the Visitor Center, and his grave. I've been to all 3 places. King sought to pull Christians into the real world, one that needed changing in accordance with the biblical standards of justice and fairness. On the night before his death, his thoughts were not so much on his journey to some long-awaited heaven, but on the possibilities that those he led would reach their destination. Quote, "I may not get there with you," he said, "but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land," end quote. Every city in America, I suppose, has a street named for Martin Luther King Jr., and the nation as a whole celebrates his life and influence with a federal holiday. But there's bad news to report about their respective legacies. Graham's white evangelicals abandoned his carefully crafted political neutrality in their headlong rush to follow Donald J. Trump. No other single episode in the last 100 years of Christianity has been so damaging to Christianity as this capitulation of the gospel to Trump. That in turn has pushed many professing Christians into the sad confession, quote, "If that is what it means to be a Christian, count me out," end quote. King's coalition of black Christians and white mainline Protestants, on the other hand, is likewise suffering from a case of disintegrating influence. Millions of white Christians, and especially their children and grandchildren, once in this cohort, have given up on the church altogether, even if they retain a self-designation as Christian. And even though their political family controls the Senate, the House, and the presidency, they appear unable to pass new legislation to protect things most precious to King. Church affiliation and Christian allegiance are in a free fall. The COVID pandemic has further undermined the vitality of many organizations and businesses, including the church. Congregations are closing, ministers are resigning, people are quitting. Only the right wing of our religion seems to have any vitality, and it has been co-opted by the Christian nationalist. It leaves us with this question: is there any version of Christian faith and practice that has the courage, the organization, and the leadership to counter both the Christian nationalism on the right and the Christian apostasy on the left? The former is determined to seize the levers of power in order to reframe these United States into their vision of a Christian nation. The latter seemingly has given up altogether on religion and has cast its lot with politics. Neither the Christianity of Graham nor that of King seem to be likely candidates for leading the revival that we need. Most of their descendants have converted either to a false gospel, Trumpism, or to a substitute savior, politics. Unless, of course, some coalition of Graham and King emerges from the mess around us, some collaboration of those in the tradition of personal salvation with those eager for social justice, unless they can coalesce into a holistic version of Christian faith and practice, strong enough, gracious enough, and persistent enough to once again make following Jesus a thing of beauty. For this I pray, and also for the soul of the nation and the well-being of the church. You're in the Meeting House, where we have conversation on religion and American life. I'm your host, Dwight A. Moody. I'll be back in just a minute with some closing thoughts. You have been in the Meeting House today with me, your host, Dwight A. Moody, coming to you from Greenville, South Carolina. Thank you for listening today and watching, or listening whenever you listen to the podcast. And I encourage you to visit our website at themeetinghouse.net. You can subscribe to my weekly newsletter. It comes out on Wednesday evening. You can read all the commentaries and reviews, including reviews of Dr. Jones' 2 books. And as soon as his new book comes out, I'll read it, review it, and invite him back into the Meeting House. You can support what we're doing here. You can send us a check. I hope you support many nonprofits. But most of the religion and media people are on the right wing of politics and religion. What we're trying to do here in the Meeting House is a minority of voices taken to the airways. So your support is very important to us. And I encourage you to go to themeetinghouse.net/support. And there you'll have an address where you can send a gift to help support what we do. We're coming to you today, of course, on the radio at rejoice975.com, over 97.5 FM, 94.7 FM in Glenn County, Georgia, and St. Simons Island, Georgia. And we're also coming through the Facebook Live, the television ministry of St. Stephen's Baptist Church, Louisville, Kentucky, ssclive.tv. And of course, always on my personal Facebook page. Thanks to engineer Everett Armstrong in the studios down in the Golden Isles of Georgia. I'm leaving in just a few minutes to head that way to escape the cold weather that's coming. Thanks to Alex Mattingly in Louisville, Kentucky, and Lexington, where she manages the St. Stephen's Broadcast Network. Thank you to Robert P. Jones for this fascinating conversation. To all of you, I pick up the prophetic call to do justice and to love mercy and to walk with God. Pray for the soul of America. In the Meeting House, I'm Dwight A. Moody. Have a great day.
You have been in the Meeting House with host Dwight A. Moody. Thank you for watching or listening today. Visit our website at themeetinghouse.net for more news, reviews,